very briefly. We've barely scratched the surface. It seems like a lot. It's a big topic, but there's a whole lot more to it. And there's a lot more to the ecosystem than just React itself. Anybody ever heard of Redux? So you've probably already gotten mildly annoyed by like passing props down through multiple components just to get to some deeply nested component. Like if you have something in app and you want to get it down to note, you have to pass the prop from app to main, from main to note list, from note list to note. Big pain in the neck. It seems like there has to be a better way, and there is a better way. There are several better ways. So one is there's something called the context API. It's been in React for kind of all along, but there was always a big fat warning on it. Do not use this in the documentation. But there's a new version of the context API in recent versions of React, and now they're saying, okay, it's cool to use this now. So that's one way to get around that. So if you're curious to learn more, you could look up React Context API. There are a lot of like really short videos and blog posts and stuff explaining it because it's something everyone was curious about because it's a solution to something that's been a problem for a long time. And that's also one of the reasons people reach for Redux. So Redux is a whole new state management library. If you don't want to, if your application is large enough and complex enough that this way of managing state just doesn't scale for you, Redux or some other state management library might be the answer. So if you're curious to learn more about the React ecosystem, Redux is a really good thing to learn because it is very widely used. There is a really good tutorial called Learn Redux, learnredux.com by Wes Boss, who did JavaScript 30 and stuff like that I recommended to you in the prereqs. Learn Redux is free. It's 20 videos. You build an Instagram clone. So if you're curious about learning Redux, it's a really good free way to learn it, and you get to build something kind of cool. The videos are a tad out of date. It uses an old version of React Router. I'm using an old version of React too, but it hasn't changed that much. React Router has changed a bit. So the routing may seem a little different, and your information is kind of more up to date than this is. But the point is learning Redux, and it teaches that really well, and it's a nice looking Instagram clone. So I do recommend checking that out if you're curious. And for heaven's sake, do something from here. If you don't keep it up, keep making little projects for yourself, you will forget. And I think it's just good to build something. Just always be building something. Make little toys if you want to, keep track of your, I don't know, fingernail collection or something, or your favorite Channing Tatum movies, whatever. Just build a little thing. Just practice. Just practice creating things. If you have somebody who knows that they want to build a little thing and they don't have any money and you don't mind doing it for them as a personal favor, do that, or charge them a little, or whatever. Don't work for free, by the way. That devalues us all. But I'm saying, do a little tiny bit of freelancing. Do something for, I don't know, your book club or your church or your orangutan juggling brigade or whatever the heck you're doing on your weekends. I don't know, you people. Just make stuff. Always be making stuff. So yeah, there's a whole lot more to React than what we've done. And as I mentioned, there's also React Native. So besides doing this stuff for the web, you can use React to make native apps for iOS and Android. And it's really cool. And it uses all the stuff we've been learning for the most part. The difference, you don't use divs and H1s and other DOM elements because there's no DOM. This is native. You just use different components instead, but you still use components. And it looks very much the same, and you style it with something that looks a lot like CSS. But you have to do it in JavaScript. So the way that we did it on the sidebar, right, where we put all the CSS-looking stuff in JavaScript using JavaScript syntax, you do that thing. You can't have an actual style sheet using CSS syntax because it ain't the web. But React Native, it's really cool. Check out the documentation. It's well documented. Of course it is. It's React. Look up React Native, see what we got. Build native mobile apps using JavaScript and React. Here's a little example. That looks a lot like React to me. You still import React and component from React. You make a class that extends component, or you make stateless functional components. Still totally works. But instead of like divs and stuff, you use things like view and text. You use these native components that are part of the React Native library. And there's even stuff like nativebase, nativebase.io, which is kind of like a bootstrap or a foundation for React Native. So it has pre-built components that already look pretty if you want a button that already has a nice blue background and a border and whatnot. Super well documented, so there's all kinds of built-in components for you to lay things out. It is a real mobile app that you build. It is not a hybrid app. So there's things like Ionic. Anybody ever heard of Ionic? Ionic is Angular-based. Angular is another JavaScript library, or it's a full-blown MVC framework for JavaScript. Anybody know what an MVC framework is? Sorry. Model View Controller. Yeah. They call it an MVW framework, Angular, actually. Model View whatever. But they're being cute. So anyway, Angular is another full-blown library that uses components and stuff, kind of similar to React in some respects. And there's a native version of that too called Ionic. But it's actually creating web views, meaning that your native app is actually kind of running a little web browser inside of it. And everything you're interacting with is actually like HTML elements. With React Native, it's a real native app. So scrolling feels a little smoother and more natural. Just, you know, the difference between the ones that feel like they're actually a website embedded in an app and the ones that feel truly native. So React Native, they're really native. So it's pretty cool. You can get started. The quick start is very quick. You don't necessarily need something like Create React App, but there is one called Create React Native App. Now, it is community managed, not Facebook managed, even though they use it in the official tutorial. And it's cool, but you may have to find that you eject very quickly from it. If you may remember when we used Create React App, there was an eject option to like actually show the configuration. Thing about Create React Native App is if you actually need to do any true native things, like suppose you wanted to use Face ID or the camera or anything like that, you can't do it with the way that it's configured out of Create React Native App. But if you build it with native code and you use their command line interface to just say React Native init in your project, it's very Create React App-like. It creates a framework for you where you can get started very quickly still. I will say this, any kind of native development is a little bit more of a pain in the neck than web development because you do have actual compiled code. And so if you're doing iOS development, you have to install Xcode, which means you have to have a Mac in the first place. If you're doing Android development, you have to install Android Studio, which is both huge and terrible. And you have to install like an Android device simulator, which are freaking huge too. It's an entire emulator for the entire thing, so it's a lot bigger than even the iOS simulator, which can still use macOS under the hood. And then just getting them to compile is a little bit of a chore. But if you can get through that initial setup, and this tutorial does get you through that, if you can get through that, the actual development is very fast and very React-like. And you can still use the React Dev tools. You have to use a standalone version. You don't do it in the web browser necessarily. But you can still totally use the React Dev tools and stuff, and it's super nice. And there's a debugger and everything. You don't actually have to fire up Xcode or Android Studio to do your work. You can use Visual Studio Code. You're just writing JavaScript, and you're building a native app. It's really cool. So if you're curious where to go from here, where to keep learning, if you want to keep doing this stuff, look into React Native. Make a native version of NoteHerder. Why the heck not? You could do it. I believe in you. So there's lots of places you could go from here. We'll talk more about some resources you can learn to, or you can use to continue your learning. There's a good newsletter called React Status. React Status newsletter. Let's see. There it is. react.statusgo.com. I subscribe to this. So I see here's the latest issue, which came out on May 25th. There it is, React 16.4 released. That's how I knew. That's how I knew the day it was released. I obviously don't have time to read through this entire newsletter every single week in its entirety, but I at least glance at the headlines. So I know kind of what's new. I can click on something to learn more if I want, or I can kind of file it away for future reference. Like, okay, I know at some point I need to look into what the heck this thing is. At least things will seem familiar when I start hearing about the same thing over and over. Like I kept hearing about Vue, V-U-E, Vue.js for months and months. And like it seems to be what all the people who used to be super hot on React are into now. I still haven't learned it, but I keep seeing it in newsletters and blogs and stuff. So I know like that's the thing I should probably learn at some point. So these newsletters are really good for stuff like that, just to stay up to date, even if you can't read them all every time. You learn advanced React component patterns. That sounds fun, although that's a sponsor. Yeah, good stuff. I highly recommend things like that. There's another one, JavaScript Weekly, from the same people that I also subscribe to. That's really good. But try to keep learning this stuff. And hopefully the stuff you've learned here is applicable even if you're not doing React or JavaScript at all, because we've seen how to troubleshoot, right? I make mistakes in class. I troubleshoot them live. Sometimes I make mistakes on purpose so I can troubleshoot them live. Most of the time it's an actual mistake, though. But hopefully it's been helpful to you to see how someone figures something out if they don't know it yet, right? That's why we like pull up the documentation in class and we look it up and we try to figure it out. All that stuff's repeatable. You can apply that to any language, right? The same debugging skills are debugging skills. So all good stuff. So there's lots you can do from here.